Birmingham, Alabama, 1963. On a bright Sunday morning, in a city trembling with the fever of change, 4 little girls put on their finest dresses and went to the one place they believed to be a sanctuary. They were the heart of their church's junior choir, a symbol of a future their community was fighting for with every prayer and every protest. But in an instant, their voices were silenced, their futures erased, and their memory buried under a mountain of concrete and lies. For 60 years, their story was a whisper, a tragedy explained away as an accident. This is the story of how a crack in a basement wall finally broke a city's long-held silence, and how the truth, once buried, can never truly be destroyed. Before I begin, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means a lot to know you're here, sharing these stories with me. We're in this together. Now let me tell you the story. The morning of September 15th, 1963, dawned with a deceptive, almost cruel sense of peace over Birmingham, Alabama. The air was warm, carrying the first faint, sweet scent of autumn, and the sky was a vast, cloudless, and brilliant blue. It was a Sunday, and for the Black community of Birmingham, Sunday was more than just a day of rest. It was a day of spiritual reinforcement, a day to gather strength for the battles that awaited them on Monday. And on this particular Sunday, the sense of hope was almost palpable. It was Youth Day at the 16th Street Baptist Church, a day when the children would lead the service, their innocent voices a powerful testament to the future their parents and elders were fighting so desperately to secure. The church itself was more than just a building of brick and mortar. It was a fortress, the command center for the city's burgeoning civil rights movement. In its basement, strategies were planned for marches and boycotts. At its pulpit, sermons of defiance and hope rang out, challenging the suffocating injustice of segregation. And in its pews, a community found the strength to endure the fire hoses, the police dogs, and the daily, grinding humiliations of a city at war with itself. To its congregation, the church was a sanctuary, a sacred ground that felt immune to the hatred that festered just beyond its stained glass windows. On this morning, 4 young girls, the heart of the junior choir, arrived early, their faces bright with the special, solemn excitement that only a child on the cusp of an important performance can feel. They were the best of friends, a small, inseparable constellation of hope and innocence. Sarah May, at 11, was the oldest, the natural leader, her expression serious and focused as she clutched her hymn book. Denise, 10, was the voice, a girl whose quiet, introspective nature would melt away the moment she began to sing, her powerful soprano a source of wonder for the entire congregation. And then there were Lillian and Ruth, both 9, the spirits of the group. Lillian, with a mischievous sparkle in her eyes, was the giggler, while Ruth, her gentle, kind nature a perfect calming balance, was her quiet shadow. They arrived in their finest Sunday dresses, starched and pressed, their hair meticulously braided and adorned with ribbons. Their parents watched them go, a mixture of pride and the low grade, constant fear that was the price of raising a black child in Birmingham in 1963. But on this morning, the pride won out. The girls were a living, breathing symbol of the future, of the world they were fighting to create. A world where their daughters could grow up, their voices strong, their spirits unbroken. As the 4 friends disappeared into the cool, quiet halls of the church, their laughter echoing on the polished wooden floors, they were the very picture of a promise, a beautiful, innocent, and tragically fragile dream. The basement of the 16th Street Baptist Church was a world unto itself. It was a cool, dim, and comforting space that smelled of old wood, floor wax, and the faint, sweet scent of the coffee that was always brewing for the Sunday school teachers. The walls of the ladies' lounge, the room where the junior choir was preparing, were covered with colorful, hand-drawn pictures of Bible stories, a vibrant, hopeful tapestry of a faith that was both simple and profound. It was here, in this room that was their own special clubhouse, that the 4 girls gathered for their final, impromptu rehearsal. It was a perfect, crystalline moment of childhood, a moment that would, in the memories of those who witnessed it, become frozen in time, polished by grief into a gem of heartbreaking, unbearable beauty. Sarah May, the serious leader, stood before the others, her hymn book open, her finger tracing the lines of the song they were to lead the congregation in that morning. She was a natural teacher, her voice a gentle, patient guide as she helped the younger girls with their parts. "Now remember, Lillian," she said, her tone a perfect imitation of their choir director. "You come in on the second verse, right after Denise holds that high note. And Ruth, you're with me on the harmony." Denise, the voice, closed her eyes, humming the note, her face a mask of pure angelic concentration. Her voice, even at 10, was a gift, a thing of wonder, a pure, powerful soprano that seemed to come from a place far beyond her small, slight frame. It was a voice that held all the hope, all the sorrow, and all the resilient, unshakable faith of her community. When she sang, the world outside, with its threats and its hatred, seemed to melt away. Lillian and Ruth, the inseparable spirits of the group, were whispering and giggling, their shared secret jokes a language of their own. They were excited about their new, matching patent leather shoes and about the special lunch that would be held after the service to celebrate Youth Day. Theirs was the simple, untroubled joy of being 9 years old on a special Sunday morning, a joy that was as bright and as fragile as a sunbeam. Through the high, small basement windows, they could hear the muffled sounds of the world above, the low, resonant rumble of the church organ as it was being warmed up, the murmur of the congregation as they found their seats, the laughter of other children playing in the churchyard. These were the sounds of their world, the comforting, familiar, and utterly safe sounds of a Sunday morning at the heart of their community. They were in a sanctuary within a sanctuary, a place of profound peace and absolute safety, poised, unknowingly, on the very precipice of history, in the final, beautiful, and innocent moments before the music, and their world, would be shattered forever. At precisely 10:22 a.m., a sound that was not of this world, a sound that was not of God, ripped through the peaceful, sacred rhythm of the Sunday morning. It was not a sound that was heard so much as it was felt, a violent, elemental roar that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. For the horrified congregation in the main sanctuary above, it was a physical blow, a concussive force that lifted them from their seats, that shook the very foundations of the massive brick building, that sent a shower of plaster and dust raining down from the high arched ceiling. The magnificent stained glass windows, which had for generations told the stories of their faith in vibrant, jeweled colors, exploded inward, a kaleidoscope of broken, sacred jewels propelled into the pews by a force of pure, malevolent energy. For the neighbors and the passers-by outside, it was a sound that was both deafening and disorienting, a brutal, earth-shattering boom that was followed an instant later by the sight of a thick, acrid, and oily column of black smoke pouring from the side of the church. Panic, immediate and absolute, erupted. In the sanctuary, screams replaced the quiet reverence of the sermon. As parents, their minds instantly going to their children in the Sunday school rooms below, began a frantic, desperate scramble toward the exits. Outside, the scene was one of chaos and disbelief. The initial, official explanation, shouted by the first, overwhelmed fireman who arrived on the scene, was a boiler accident. It was a plausible, mechanical, and, most importantly, a non-political explanation, a way to contain the narrative, to manage the panic, to explain the unthinkable in the simple, logical terms of a tragic malfunction. But there were other voices, other witnesses, whose stories were immediately and deliberately lost in the chaos. An old man who had been sitting on his porch across the street swore he had seen a car, a green and white Chevrolet, idling by the side of the church just moments before the event, and then speeding away, its tires squealing, in the seconds immediately following. Another woman, a teacher on her way to the service, had seen a man place a box under the steps of the church's side entrance. But their voices were just whispers in a hurricane of noise, of sirens, of screams, of a city that was, in that moment, descending into a nightmare. The official story was an accident, and in a city as deeply and as violently divided as Birmingham, the official story was the only one that mattered. In the immediate chaotic aftermath of the tragedy, a second, more insidious and more calculated act of violence began to unfold: the burying of the truth. While the smoke was still rising from the side of the church, a wall of official silence and deliberate obfuscation began to descend, a wall that would stand, impenetrable, for nearly 60 years. The scene was controlled not just by the fire department, but by a team of local investigators, men who were not just officers of the law, but were also, in many cases, open and unapologetic segregationists, men who viewed the 16th Street Baptist Church not as a house of God, but as the headquarters of an enemy force. The narrator details how the investigation was, from its very first moments, a masterclass in suppression. Reports from the credible and deeply inconvenient eyewitnesses who had seen the car, who had seen the man with the box, were lost, misplaced in the chaos, their testimonies deemed unreliable or hysterical. The physical evidence that pointed to a planted device, the telltale, non-accidental fragments of a timing mechanism that had been found in the rubble, were quietly removed from the official evidence logs, their existence denied. The families of the 4 girls, their grief a raw, open, and unendurable wound, were treated not with compassion, but with a cold, dismissive, and deeply racist condescension. When they pushed for answers, when they demanded to know how a boiler accident could have caused such a devastating and targeted event, they were met with a wall of bureaucratic silence. And then they were given the final, most devastating, and most cruelly calculated news of all. Their daughter's remains were. The coroner informed them with a kind of clinical, detached pity, beyond identification. It was a lie, a brutal and monstrous lie, designed to end the questions, to close the book, to prevent the 4 small, open caskets that would have been a powerful, undeniable, and deeply inconvenient symbol of the true nature of the crime. The city council, led by powerful figures who were desperate to avoid the national scrutiny and federal intervention that a confirmed, racially motivated act of hate would inevitably bring, issued a public statement calling for peace and calm. They promised a full and thorough investigation, a promise that was a hollow, cynical, and deliberate falsehood. The case files, the few that had been created, were quietly moved to a deep, inaccessible storage archive. The tragedy at the 16th Street Baptist Church was not a crime to be solved. It was a public relations crisis to be managed, and the most effective way to manage it was to erase it. The narrative jumps forward 60 years, to the Birmingham of 2023. The city has changed, at least on the surface. The whites-only signs are gone, the laws have been rewritten, and the city now presents itself as a model of the New South, a place of racial healing and progressive ideals. The 16th Street Baptist Church, though scarred and rebuilt, still stands, a historic landmark, a tourist destination, its rebuilt Sunday school wing now a modern, functional community center. But for some, the past is not a museum piece. It is a living, breathing, and deeply unhealed wound. On a wall in a quiet, unassuming hallway of the community center, 4 faded black and white portraits hang in a row. They are the only public memorial to the girls who were lost in 1963. Their smiles, captured in the innocent, hopeful light of a long-ago school picture day, are a silent, heartbreaking testament to a story the city has tried so hard to forget. The narrator introduces us to one of the last, living links to that story. Sarah May's mother. She is now an elderly woman in her late 80s, her body made frail by the passage of 6 long decades, but her spirit as strong and as dignified as ever. We see her as she attends the small, sparsely covered candlelight vigil that is held every single year on the anniversary of the event. The crowd is small, mostly made up of the aging family members of the 4 girls and a handful of dedicated community activists. The major news stations no longer cover it. It is a private grief, a forgotten history. Her sorrow is not the loud, performative grief of a recent tragedy. It is a quiet, constant, and deeply lonely flame that has burned within her for 60 years. She has outlived her husband, her friends, and most of the other parents. She is the living memory, the last, first-hand witness to a crime for which there was never any justice. She stands before the faded portrait of her 11-year-old daughter, her hand clutching a single white candle, her face a mask of profound and quiet sorrow. She does not weep. Her tears, she has said, ran dry a lifetime ago. But in her eyes, there is a look of such profound and unresolved loss that it is a silent, powerful, and deeply damning accusation against the city and the country that had allowed her daughter's memory to be buried for so long. The catalyst for the unearthing of the truth was not an act of justice, but an act of renewal. During the extensive renovations of the community center in the fall of 2023, a construction crew was tasked with a routine, if unusual, job: the removal of an old, strangely reinforced, and seemingly pointless wall in the basement. The wall was not on any of the original blueprints of the church. It was a clumsy, thick addition of brick and concrete that had been added at some point after the rebuilding in the 1960 seconds, creating a small, inaccessible, and completely dead space. As the crew, with their sledgehammers and their crowbars, began to break through the thick, solid wall, they expected to find nothing but dirt and old foundation. But as the first, large chunks of concrete and brick were pulled away, a strange, musty, and ancient smell wafted out, the smell of a room that had not breathed the air of the outside world for a very, very long time. They broke a larger hole, and a foreman shone a high-powered flashlight into the darkness. They had not uncovered a utility closet or a part of the foundation. They had uncovered a sealed room, a time capsule from the day of the tragedy. Inside, preserved in the dry, still air of the tomb-like space, was a scene of life interrupted, a tableau of a Sunday morning that had been frozen in time for 60 years. There were hymn books scattered on the floor, some of them still open to the song the girls had been practicing. There was a small, black, patent leather shoe lying on its side, its buckle still polished. And there were fragments of charred, dark blue fabric from the original choir robes, items that the families had been told, for 6 long decades, had been completely destroyed in the blast, too damaged to be returned. The room was not just a time capsule, it was a crime scene, a deliberately and meticulously sealed space where the evidence of what had truly happened on that day had been hidden, buried behind a wall of concrete and lies. The discovery of the sealed room made the local news, a strange, historical curiosity that was, at first, treated as little more than a local interest story. But the story reached the desk of Dr. Monica James, a civil rights historian and professor at the university in nearby Tuscaloosa, and she immediately, and with a jolt of pure academic adrenaline, recognized its profound and potentially explosive significance. Dr. James was a woman who had dedicated her life to uncovering and preserving the stories that had been deliberately erased from the official, sanitized record of the civil rights era. She was not a native of Birmingham, but she had made the city's complex and often painful history her life's work. She was sharp, articulate, and relentless, with a deep and often infuriating to those in power, the understanding of the systemic and bureaucratic tactics that had been used for generations to enforce segregation and to silence dissent. She knew, with an absolute, historical certainty, that the sealed room was not just a time capsule. It was proof of a cover-up, a deliberate, and almost certainly official, an act of concealing physical evidence. The items in that room, the hymn books, the shoe, the robe fragments, were not just sentimental artifacts. They were forensic evidence that had been deliberately and systematically hidden from the families, from the public, and from any real investigation. She began a relentless and highly public campaign. She wrote editorials for the state's major newspapers. She appeared on local news programs, her voice a calm, authoritative, and deeply compelling counter-narrative to the city's long-held story of a tragic accident. She petitioned the mayor's office, she petitioned the district attorney, she petitioned the state's attorney general to officially reopen the 60-year-old cold case. She argued, with a powerful and legally sound logic, that the discovery of the sealed room constituted new evidence, and that the city had a moral, a legal, and a historical obligation to finally and truly uncover the truth of what had happened to the four little girls. She was the crucial bridge between the past and the present, the one person with the expertise, the platform, and the moral authority to force a reluctant and deeply compromised city to confront its own buried and bloody history. The public pressure campaign, led by the formidable and media-savvy Dr. James, began to gain traction. The story was no longer just a local curiosity. It was becoming a statewide cause célèbre, an uncomfortable and deeply shaming reminder of a past that the state's modern, progressive image was designed to obscure. And it was this pressure that led to an unexpected and deeply significant breakthrough. The granddaughter of a retired and now deceased Birmingham police detective came forward. She was a woman in her 60s who, while cleaning out her grandfather's attic after his recent death, had stumbled upon a collection of his old, private journals. In one of them, in a series of entries dated from the fall of 1963, she had found his own, private, and deeply guilt-ridden account of the church case. Her grandfather, a man she had known only as a quiet, stoic, and deeply honorable man, had been one of the lead investigators on the original case, and his journal told a story that was a universe away from the official narrative of an accident. He wrote of the witnesses who had seen the car, of the fragments of the timing device that he himself had found in the rubble. And he wrote, in a voice full of a deep and obviously painful professional shame, of the direct and undeniable orders he and his colleagues had received from above to close the file. We were told, in no uncertain terms, by the chief, who was getting his orders directly from the council, to stop pursuing any leads that pointed to a planted device. He had written, his handwriting a sharp, angry scrawl. We were ordered to officially label the event an accident and to move on. They said it was to maintain the peace. But it was not about peace. It was about politics. And it was about protecting the men who had done this. I have 4 daughters of my own. God forgive me for what I have been a part of. The granddaughter, her own conscience stirred by the public campaign and the raw, painful honesty of her grandfather's words, contacted Dr. James. The journal was a ghost, a voice from the grave of one of the system's own, a direct, first-hand, and deeply damning confirmation of the cover-up that had been a whispered but unproven rumor for 60 long years. The detective's journal, combined with the discovery of the sealed room, was the tipping point. The city, facing a full-blown national scandal, had no choice but to officially reopen the investigation into the deaths of the 4 girls. The case, which had been buried in the archives for 60 years, was now an active, high-priority, cold case homicide investigation. A new and deeply motivated team of forensic investigators began a modern, 21st-century analysis of the items that had been found in the sealed crawl space, items that had been preserved in the dry, still, and tomb-like air, in a state of remarkable and deeply revealing preservation. The narrator builds suspense as they process the decades-old evidence, using technologies that were the stuff of science fiction in 1963. They found more than just hymn books and robe fragments, tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the corner of the sealed room, a space that had clearly been missed by the original, cursory, and deliberately incomplete search. They found 2 small and incredibly significant items: a crumpled, half-smoked cigarette butt and an old, half-used, and very distinctive matchbook, its cover advertising a local and notoriously segregated diner. The cigarette butt, 60 years old and seemingly useless, was a potential gold mine. DNA technology, which had not even been a theoretical concept in 1963, was now able to pull a partial and legally admissible genetic profile from the minute preserved traces of saliva that still clung to the paper. The matchbook, with its distinctive logo, provided a crucial geographical and cultural link, a connection to a known and well-documented gathering place for the city's most ardent and most violent segregationists. The science of the present was about to unlock the secrets of the past, and the silence that had protected the perpetrators for a lifetime was about to be broken. The partial DNA profile, extracted from the 60-year-old cigarette butt, was a fragile, incomplete, but incredibly powerful thread. It was run through the vast, national and federal databases, a digital fishing expedition in an ocean of genetic information. And they got a hit. It was not a direct match to a known criminal, but a familial match, a link to a man who had been arrested for a minor, unrelated crime years ago. A man who was the distant nephew of a known, and now deceased, member of a local and notoriously violent, extremist segregationist group from the 1962nd. This familial link was the first, concrete, and scientific connection between the crime scene and a network of potential perpetrators. And it was the key that unlocked the next, and most crucial, phase of the investigation. Armed with this new, powerful lead, Dr. Monica James, the historian, began her own deep and scholarly dive into the dark and often deliberately obscured archives of these long-defunct hate groups. She spent weeks in the dusty, neglected basements of university libraries and state archives, sifting through old, microfilmed membership lists, surveillance reports from the FBI's early and often half-hearted attempts to monitor these groups, and the self-published, racist newsletters they had once distributed. It was a painstaking, and often deeply disturbing, process of cross-referencing the deceased man's known associates with the names of other known extremists from that era. And then, after weeks of dead ends and false leads, a single and still living name emerged from the past, a name that had appeared on multiple membership lists, a name that had been mentioned in an old, redacted FBI report as being a person of interest in a number of other, racially motivated incidents from that time, a name that was, in the small, insular world of Birmingham's surviving segregationists, a quiet, almost forgotten legend, Earl Whitman. He was a man who had, for 60 years, lived a quiet, unassuming, and completely anonymous life in a neighboring county, a ghost from the city's violent past who was about to be dragged, kicking and screaming, into the light. With a name to focus on, the investigation into the why of the tragedy gained a new and chilling clarity. Earl Whitman was not a lone wolf, not a solitary, crazed actor. He was a part of a small, disciplined, and deeply committed cell of extremists, a group that had called itself, with a kind of bland, bureaucratic evil, the Neighborhood Protection Club. It was a front, a respectable-sounding name for a group of 4 men who were, in reality, a violent, domestic terror cell. The narrator reveals that Whitman and the 3 other men, all of whom were now deceased, were virulently and psychotically opposed to the civil rights movement, and in particular, to the recent court-ordered integration of Birmingham's public schools. Their motive was pure, calculated, and monstrously simple: terror. They wanted to send a message so loud, so violent, and so horrifying that it would shatter the will of the city's black community, that it would halt the progress of the movement in its tracks, that it would scare black families into a state of silent and permanent submission. The 16th Street Baptist Church was not a random target. It was the heart. It was the strategic and spiritual center of the movement in Birmingham. It was the place where the mass meetings were held, where the nonviolence workshops trained a new generation of activists, where the voter registration drives that so terrified the white power structure were organized. To them, the church was not a house of God. It was the enemy's headquarters. The act they had planned and carried out was not a spontaneous act of rage. It was a calculated, military-style operation designed for maximum symbolic and psychological impact. By targeting the church, and by targeting it on Youth Day, they were not just attacking a building, they were attacking the very idea of a future for Birmingham's black community. They were attacking the children. It was an act of pure, unadulterated, and deeply strategic hate. As the investigation into Earl Whitman and his co-conspirators deepened, Dr. James and a new, motivated, and deeply committed cold case detective uncovered the final, most devastating, and most politically explosive layer of the cover-up. The conspiracy of hate, they discovered, had been protected by a conspiracy of power. Their search led them back to the city's own dusty archives, to a collection of buried city council memos and the minutes from a series of secret, closed-door meetings that had been held in the frantic, chaotic weeks following the tragedy in 1963. The documents, which had been misfiled and deliberately obscured for 60 years, revealed a chilling and deeply cynical political calculation. They revealed that a prominent local politician at the time, a man who had gone on to have a long and storied career in state politics, had actively and secretly colluded with the city's then police chief to suppress the findings of the original investigation. The documents showed that the police chief had, within days of the event, reported to the politician that his investigators had conclusive evidence of a planted device and had a list of credible suspects, all of them known members of local extremist groups. But the politician, terrified of the political and economic fallout that a confirmed, racially motivated terror act would bring upon the city, had ordered him to stand down. The memos revealed his chillingly pragmatic and deeply immoral logic. A full and truthful investigation would bring national scrutiny. It would bring federal intervention. It would brand Birmingham, a city that was trying to project an image of a modern, New South metropolis, as a hotbed of racist violence. It would be bad for business. It was necessary, he had argued, to protect the city's reputation, to maintain civic order, and to prevent the kind of federal overreach that was, to the segregationist power structure, a fate worse than the crime itself. The decision was made, in the secret, smoke-filled rooms of power, to sacrifice the truth, and to sacrifice justice for 4 little girls, on the altar of political and economic expediency. The monster had a guardian angel, and it was the city itself. The arrest, when it came, was not a dramatic, high-stakes raid. It was a quiet, almost surreal, and deeply anticlimactic affair. There were no sirens, no SWAT teams, no dramatic standoff. 2 plainclothes federal investigators, their faces grim and professional, drove to a quiet, sterile, and anonymous-looking nursing home in a neighboring county, a place that smelled of disinfectant and quiet, slow decay. They found Earl Whitman, now a frail, wheelchair-bound man in his late 80s, sitting in the common room, his vacant eyes fixed on the flickering, too-loud screen of a television that was playing a daytime game show. The narrator describes the chilling, almost unbelievable contrast between his feeble, pathetic appearance and the monstrous, world-shattering act he had orchestrated 60 years before. He was a ghost from a violent, hateful past, a man who had outlived his own terrible history, and who had, it seemed, been completely and comfortably forgotten. When the investigators approached him, identified themselves, and informed him that he was under arrest for his role in the 1963 church event, his reaction was not one of shock or of fear. It was one of pure, unadulterated, and deeply ingrained contempt. He denied everything, his voice a weak, papery, and barely audible rasp, but his eyes, for a brief, terrifying moment, held a flicker of the old, cold, and venomous hatred that had motivated him a lifetime ago. He invoked a code of old loyalty, refusing to speak, refusing to cooperate, a silent, defiant, and unrepentant monster to the very end. The man who had helped to orchestrate one of the most infamous acts of racial terror in American history was taken into custody without a struggle. His capture not a bang, but a quiet, pathetic, and long overdue whimper. Earl Whitman's defiance was a final, futile gesture. The case against him no longer rested on a confession. It rested on the cold, hard, and irrefutable certainty of science. Whitman, citing his age and his frail health, and invoking a code of old loyalty that was, in reality, just a final, arrogant act of obstruction, refused to provide a DNA sample. But the investigators, led by a new and deeply committed generation of forensic scientists, didn't need his cooperation. They turned their attention to the science of genealogy, to the vast and ever-expanding public and private databases that could trace a family's genetic history through the generations. They tracked down a surviving, distant relative of Whitman's, a grandnephew, a man in his 40s who was a respected member of his own community, a man who was horrified and deeply shamed to learn of his family's potential connection to the infamous and long unsolved crime. He willingly, and with a sense of a deep historical duty, provided a DNA sample. The lab worked quickly, and the results came back with an absolute and legally unassailable certainty. The familial link between the grandnephew and the partial DNA profile that had been extracted from the 60-year-old cigarette butt found in the sealed, hidden crawl space was a perfect match. The 60-year-old case finally had its undeniable and scientifically perfect proof. The city of Birmingham, its long and deliberately maintained wall of denial now completely and publicly shattered, was forced to hold a press conference. The mayor, a new and deeply progressive leader who had inherited the city's dark and now fully exposed history, stood before a phalanx of national news cameras, and his voice thick with an emotion that was both personal and historical. He officially and publicly acknowledged what the families and the community had known all along. It was not an accident. It was a racially motivated act of hate, an act of terror, for which the city was finally and formally beginning to atone. The news of Whitman's arrest and the city's official, public acknowledgement of the crime sent a powerful, emotional shockwave through Birmingham. It was a moment of profound and deeply complex catharsis, a collective unburdening of a grief that had been suppressed and a truth that had been denied for 60 long years. The narrator describes a scene of this catharsis at the newly renovated 16th Street Baptist Church. The families of the 4 girls, a group that now spanned 3, and in some cases 4, generations, gathered in the sanctuary. Grandparents who had buried their memories in a lifetime of silent, private grief now stood beside their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, young people who were learning the full, horrifying, and deeply personal truth of their own families and their city's history for the very first time. The church's current pastor, a man who had inherited the spiritual and historical weight of the pulpit, delivered a powerful and deeply moving sermon. He spoke not of vengeance, but of justice. He spoke not of anger, but of the slow, patient, and ultimately triumphant power of the truth. His voice, strong and resonant, echoed through the same sacred space that had once been shattered by a sound of pure, unadulterated hate. Justice, he declared, his gaze sweeping over the tear-streaked faces of his congregation, took 60 years to find its way through the rubble. It was lost for a time, buried under a mountain of concrete and lies, but it never lost the path. And today, justice has finally come home. The service was not a funeral. It was a resurrection, a public and long overdue reclaiming of a story that had for too long been told only in whispers. The story concludes not with a legal verdict, but with a final and far more powerful act of remembrance. A beautiful, somber, and deeply moving memorial has been erected on a new memorial wall inside the renovated church. The 4 faded, black and white portraits that had hung in the hallway for decades have been replaced by a beautiful and permanent bronze plaque. On it, professionally restored and heartbreakingly clear, photographs of the 4 girls, their smiles now eternal, are displayed. Sarah May, Denise, Lillian, and Ruth. Their names, which had been a symbol of a city's shame, were now, finally, a symbol of its long, painful, and ultimately redemptive journey toward the truth. At the dedication ceremony, Sarah May's mother, now 89, her body frail but her spirit as strong, as resilient, and as dignified as ever, is escorted to the wall. She reaches out a trembling hand, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool glass over her daughter's smiling 11-year-old face. "You can rest now, baby," she whispers, her voice thick with 60 years of unshed tears. A quiet, personal, and profoundly moving final goodbye. They can't hide you anymore. The camera pulls back to show workers in the churchyard, planting a young, vibrant magnolia tree, a symbol of new life, of resilience, of a future that is now, finally, free to grow in the light of the truth. As the community, gathered in the sanctuary, begins to softly, and then more powerfully, sing the same beautiful hymn the girls were practicing on that long ago. And terrible, morning, the narrator closes with a final, powerful, and deeply hopeful thought. For 60 years, 4 little girls waited beneath the weight of concrete and lies. Now, their names are spoken in the open air again. Thank you for watching.